Hi, I'm Mireya. My son told me to sleep in the storage shed behind the house I once paid off for him. He said it was temporary. But then my photos disappeared from the walls, my name vanished from the deed, and the birthday gift I made for my grandson was signed by someone else. And when I stopped asking for space at their table, they started packing my things without a word. What do you do when your own family starts treating you like an afterthought, like a burden they can't wait to move out? What happens when the people you gave everything to slowly erase you, one silent decision at a time? The night air in Tucson carried a kind of stillness that made everything feel slower, gentler, even. I stood at the stove in my worn slippers, the same ones Elwood gave me 3 Christmases ago when he still remembered such things. The scent of chamomile steeping in my favorite blue mug wrapped around me like an old friend. It had been a long day, laundry, dishes, prepping Callista's gluten-free dinner, and rocking the baby to sleep while she managed content in the living room. I wasn't bitter. I didn't do those things for gratitude. I did them because I was a mother. That's what we do, or so I told myself. It was almost midnight when I rinsed the last dish and turned off the kitchen light. I just slipped under the quilt in my room, my bones aching in that familiar way they always did before a rainstorm, when the knock came. Not a gentle tap, sharp, deliberate. I sat up, heart quickening, the hallway outside dimly lit. The door creaked open, and there stood Callista, her arms folded across her robe like a tightly sealed envelope. "Hey, sorry to wake you," she said, tone too cheerful for the hour. "It's just, the baby's not sleeping well. The room's too small, with the crib. Elle and I thought maybe you could move, just temporarily." I blinked, unsure if I was dreaming. "Move where?" She smiled, as if announcing a surprise. "The shed, just until the baby adjusts." Before I could respond, Elwood appeared behind her. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence told me everything. I nodded once, slowly, pulled the covers back, and stood. No argument, no protest, just a sharp breath I held in the back of my throat, because arguing would have made me the ungrateful one, the dramatic one, the inconvenience. Again, I packed my pillow, a folded blanket, and the paperback novel I had been rereading for the 4th time. The hallway seemed longer than usual as I passed the baby's door. Callista was already inside, humming a lullaby, victorious. Outside, the porch light flickered, casting long shadows across the walkway. I stepped toward the shed, the door creaking like it hadn't been touched in years. The inside smelled of mildew and dust, like forgotten Christmas decorations and broken intentions. Cobwebs stretched from shelf to ceiling, boxes labeled college stuff and old tax files lined the corners. A cot, barely wider than my hips, waited like an unkind invitation. I set my pillow down, wiped the cot with my sleeve, and lowered myself slowly onto the stiff cushion. Somewhere in the house, a fridge hummed. A dog barked 2 streets over. The baby cried briefly, then silence. My silence. I closed my eyes and listened to it wrap around me, suffocating in its quiet agreement. Morning came not with sunlight, but with voices. Callista's, bright and performative. She was in the kitchen, hosting. I peeked through the cracked shed window and saw her offering muffins to 2 women I didn't recognize. One of them, blonde with a thick necklace, gestured toward the yard and said, "Oh, you didn't tell me you had help." Callista laughed. "Oh, that's Elle's mom. She's just staying with us while she figures things out." I didn't move. I couldn't. My hands clenched around my mug, knuckles pale, just staying with us, like I was some drifter, like this wasn't the house I helped them buy, the down payment pulled from the life insurance of my dead husband, like I was temporary. The woman nodded. It's sweet. You're letting her stay. Letting. Later that afternoon, as they laughed about recipes and Instagram hacks, I walked through the side yard to collect the laundry Callista had left half wet in the machine. One of the guests caught my eye and offered a smile that said, "Bless your heart." I smiled back, that same rehearsed expression I'd worn for years. I spent the rest of the day in the shed, sorting through a box of old lesson plans. Pages yellowed with age, my handwriting looping confidently in red ink. The plans had purpose. I did too once. Night came again, and with it, the laughter from inside the house. Distant, muffled, but persistent. I didn't cry. I stared at a nail sticking out of the wall across from my cot, just high enough to once hold a picture frame. I imagined hanging one there now, just a frame, no photo, just absence. I slipped into my coat before lying down, not because it was cold, but because the weight of it reminded me I was still here, still something, still someone. That night, I slept with my coat on, not just for warmth, but to remind myself I wasn't staying long. A key I hadn't touched since the year my husband passed, the year I thought everything would get better, sat in the palm of my hand as the faint clatter of silverware carried from the house. I had just returned from the laundromat. Callista didn't like me using the washer during dinner prep hours, so I found a place 3 blocks away. It was quiet there, and no one looked at me like I needed to apologize for existing. Inside the house, I heard her voice rising, full of performative hospitality. "Don't forget the balsamic. It's in the side pantry," she called out. I peeked from the shed's narrow window. She was setting the table, linen napkins, wine glasses I hadn't seen since Christmas. A centerpiece of fresh-cut flowers stood tall in the middle like a crown. There were 10 chairs around that table. None of them had my name. I walked in through the back door, offering to help chop vegetables or at least clear the prep station. Callista glanced over her shoulder. "It's a bit crowded in here, Mireya. Maybe you could just relax for tonight." Relax, that word again. I backed out slowly, not wanting to make it a scene. I filled a small bowl of fruit and waited in the shed as guests arrived. I heard names I hadn't heard in years. Elwood's cousins, a friend from Callista's work, someone named Andrea, who laughed like she wanted the whole street to hear. Laughter spilled out through the cracked kitchen window. Someone put on music, then chairs scraped, plates clinked, and the meal began. I stepped inside when the noise quieted. The table was full. I paused, plate in hand. No one noticed. Elwood finally looked up and said, "Maybe Mom can eat after the kids." Callista nodded like it made sense. We just didn't plan on extra seating. I nodded, smiled as if it didn't sting, and backed out the same way I came in. My plate of fruit and crackers sat untouched on my lap as I watched the lights flicker through the sheer curtain of the shed window. My son's silhouette leaned toward his wife as she poured him another glass. The baby cried once, then was passed along to someone else. No one came to ask me. They weren't even pretending anymore. The next day, I swept the porch of the shed, though no one asked me to. I wiped down the outdoor chairs. I fed the stray cat that hovered near the trash bins. It felt like I was fading into the backdrop, less a person, more a fixture. Later that week, I walked past Elwood's car as he sat on a call. The window cracked just enough. "Yeah," he was saying, "we have an elderly woman living out back. My wife's mother-in-law. She stays in the shed. Doesn't need much." My name wasn't mentioned. I stood still, gripping the paper bag I had brought from the market. Something in me settled. Not sadness, not anger, just the solid weight of knowing I was no longer someone. I was something, a convenience, a box on a form. That evening, I didn't ask if anyone needed help folding towels. I didn't offer to cook or pick up groceries. I took my dinner, a can of soup, and half a sandwich, to the shed and sat in the far corner, writing. It had been years since I kept a journal. The last entry was dated 2 days after my husband's funeral. This time, I wrote only one line. "If I am not welcome at their table, I will build my own." I stared at the words for a long time. They didn't feel bitter. They felt like roots, something beginning, not ending. Before I turned out the light, I reached for a shoebox buried under old receipts and insurance statements. Inside was the key, worn, cold, still wrapped in the envelope he left me. The one he said not to open unless I needed to remember who I was. I held it tightly as I turned off the lamp. He picked up on the second ring and said, "You're finally ready, aren't you?" I didn't answer right away. My hand still held the key, my thumb pressed against the fading inscription on the envelope that had kept it hidden for so long. It wasn't just a key to a lock. It was a key to something I'd buried with too many memories, too many compromises, but I didn't call to reminisce. I called because I was starting to feel myself being erased. That morning, Callista announced she was doing spring cleaning. Her words, airy and enthusiastic, like she was announcing a giveaway on a morning talk show. I heard boxes thumping onto the floor, the sound of drawers being opened without pause. From the doorway of the kitchen, I saw her sorting items into neat piles, holiday china, mismatched frames, and then my life, my teaching awards, the silver frame photo of my wedding, and the album I made after Elwood's graduation, all laid out like donations, waiting for approval. She didn't say anything when I stepped closer. She just smiled. "We're just making some space, Mireya. Don't worry, nothing's being thrown out." I nodded, even though my stomach had begun its familiar twist. Later that afternoon, when she left to pick up diapers, I opened the top box. My wedding photo had been wrapped in newspaper, news from 1992, coincidentally, the year we bought this house. On the back of one baby photo, the corner where my name had been written in marker was half scratched off, not entirely gone, but fading, just like me. I didn't take the picture out. I left it right there, under a stack of kindergarten drawings and PTA certificates I had framed with pride. If they needed space, they could keep it. I had already started taking mine. That evening, my grandson Liam bounded into the shed with crayon-smudged fingers, proudly holding up a sheet of paper. "It's our family," he said, waving it. The drawing was crude but clear. Callista, Elwood, the baby, his real family, all standing together with big smiles. I scanned the page twice. I wasn't there. "Where's Grandma?" I asked softly. He looked up, confused. "You don't live in the house. You live in the little house," Daddy said. I kissed his forehead and told him to go show his mom. When he left, I folded the paper and slid it into my journal. It wasn't his fault. He was only repeating what he heard. That night, I pulled out my belongings in silence. I began stacking journals from over the years. I wiped off the photo of my husband and placed it by the small window that looked out toward the garden. The cot was still hard, the light still dim, but the space had changed because now it was intentional. If they won't remember me, I wrote in my journal, I'll remember myself. I stopped setting places at the table. I no longer knocked before entering the main house. I took my tea on the porch of the shed, cross-legged, like I used to sit in the faculty lounge during parent-teacher conference nights, still, observant, unbothered. One evening, I walked the narrow garden path behind the house. The sky was warm, deep blue, melting into orange. I paused where the yard met the fence and looked up at the back window that used to be mine. The curtains were closed, the lights were off. It felt like standing outside a version of my life that no longer needed me. That's when it clicked. This wasn't just loss. This was something else, something colder. It was strategy, a slow redirection of importance, and I had let it happen, one tiny compromise at a time. But not anymore. I went back into the shed and opened the old shoebox again. The key was still there, alongside a folded piece of paper my husband had left. A note scribbled in his messy, fast handwriting. If they stop seeing you, make them look. I picked up the phone and called Marcus. He was the only one who ever knew about the property clause in the second deed. The man who once sat beside my husband as they drew up documents no one else bothered to understand. He picked up on the second ring. You're finally ready, aren't you? The corner of the paper was faded, but the name on it was mine. That night, I stared at my husband's signature longer than I'd ever stared at my own face in the mirror. It felt like reaching back and finding a hand still holding yours when you thought you'd been walking alone. The next morning, I stepped outside the shed just after sunrise, dragging the trash bin toward the curb. I move slower these days, but I like the quiet before Tucson woke up. As I pulled the lid open, a woman I didn't recognize from a few doors down waved while watering her succulents. You help out around here? She called, friendly-like. I smiled, unsure what to say. I thought you were their live-in, she continued. They're lucky. Good help's hard to find. I stood there, holding a trash bag, and nodded like it didn't pierce something deep. She meant no harm, but she'd said it so easily, like I didn't belong to the family who lived 30 feet away. I went back inside and sat on the cot, staring at the folded deed on the small makeshift table. The name was still there, mine. I whispered it out loud just to remember what it sounded like. That night, as I was putting away a small box of holiday napkins I'd taken from the laundry, something caught my eye. A soft blink of red light from the top shelf. My heart jumped, but I didn't make a sound. I climbed up carefully and saw it, a nanny cam. A tiny black lens, no bigger than a thimble, wedged between board games we hadn't played in years. No panic, just stillness. I unplugged it, wrapped the cord around the base, and placed it neatly in an old shoebox labeled broken. Then I slid the box to the back of the shelf, behind a stack of fabric scraps and old tax documents. No confrontation. I'd already learned that silence did more damage than shouting ever could. That blinking light unraveled everything. I traced the moment back to a week earlier. Callista had come into the shed mid-morning, saying the heater might need adjusting. She'd lingered, fiddled with the vents, pretended not to notice my questions. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't kindness. They didn't trust me. Later that day, while taking out a bag of recyclables, I caught sight of Callista's shopping list crumpled on the kitchen counter. The top line read, "Change meds." Beneath it, "Install cam." The last item said, "Limit outings." Not suggestions, not care, orders. It hit like a second slap. My life, reduced to a checklist of containment. Not a person, just a variable to manage. Back in the shed, I stood in front of the small mirror above the sink. "You're not invisible," I whispered to my reflection. "You're just inconvenient." That night, I didn't knock to ask if dinner was ready. I made my own, scrambled eggs and toast. The smell wafted past the window. No one came to check. I ate on the porch, legs crossed, a candle lit next to my plate. A breeze brushed the trees, soft and indifferent. I took my time, not waiting for anyone to notice, but knowing they would. When I finished, I opened my journal and began to write. "If they want to see everything I do," I wrote, "let them watch me become someone they can't predict." I closed the journal and slid open the bottom drawer of my husband's old desk, where I'd moved it last spring. There, beneath an envelope of birth certificates and insurance records, was a manila folder with a notary's seal. I opened it. The first page had faded from time and sunlight, but the ink remained legible. Ownership transfer, Mireya Gonzalez, date, signed April 3rd, 2009. Witnessed by Marcus Delaney, Esco. My fingers ran along the seal. That name, my name, was still there. I smiled as I peeled the note from the table. It was the first proof they were finally paying attention. The handwriting was unmistakably Callista's, looping and careful. "Please don't make this difficult," it said, like I had somehow complicated a system they spent months fine-tuning. That morning had started like any other. I took the bus into town, grocery list folded in my coat pocket. The list was short, just enough for me. I used to plan meals for the whole house, coordinating with Callista's dietary needs, Elwood's dislikes, and Liam's snacks. Not anymore. The cashier was young, polite, and tried not to look uncomfortable when my card declined. I offered him a tight smile, told him the chip had been acting up, and dug into my pocket for a few crumpled bills I'd tucked into the lining weeks ago. He nodded, bagged my items slowly. "Have a good day, ma'am." I walked out without making eye contact, but the heat rose in my cheeks like a fever I couldn't sweat out. That card had been tied to my personal account until Elwood insisted we streamline the family finances last year. Now it seemed Callista managed everything, including what I could or couldn't spend on soup and soap. Back at the shed, I tucked the groceries into the small fridge and boiled water for tea. When Elwood stopped by later that evening to check in, I asked him calmly why the card hadn't worked. He looked caught off guard but recovered quickly. "Callista thought you might forget things. We just wanted to make sure everything stays simple." Simple. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I nodded, thanked him, and closed the door. Later, I wrote in my journal, "This is not protection. This is permissionless control." The next day, I noticed something strange. The pills in my container looked different, smaller, off-white instead of pink. I'd been on the same prescription for years. When I checked the label, it looked new, as if recently filled, but the dosage wasn't right. I searched the kitchen cabinets and found the original bottle shoved behind a row of cleaning supplies. Callista walked in while I stood there holding both bottles. Her smile was rehearsed. "Oh, your prescription changed. I meant to tell you. The doctor updated it." I didn't believe her, but I said nothing. She left, satisfied, with my silence. That night, I made no dinner for the house. I set one plate, chicken breast, roasted carrots, wild rice, on the small folding table outside the shed. I lit a candle, poured a glass of water, and sat across from the empty chair. No one joined me, no one asked, but the window lights flickered off one by one as the house dimmed. They knew, and that was enough. Inside the shed, I opened my journal again, tore out a clean page, and wrote slowly, "I am not your burden. I am your mother. If you insist on treating me as an object to manage, I will become a problem you cannot contain." I folded the letter and slid it between the pages of an old novel on the nightstand. When I awoke the next morning, the plate was gone. In its place sat the post-it. "Please don't make this difficult." I held it in my hand for a long while before peeling it loose from the wood. I wasn't angry. I was finally understood. I didn't buy that house to get even. I bought it because I finally believed I deserved space that no one could take from me. The letter arrived, folded neatly inside a white envelope, addressed not to me, but to Elwood Martin. It bore the seal of the county assessor's office. I wasn't expecting anything that day, so I left it on the porch table beside the small stack of mail. But curiosity eventually won, and I slipped my finger under the flap, easing it open. The letter congratulated Elwood on his continued ownership of the property, my home. It mentioned an automatic tax adjustment in his name. My name was nowhere on the page. It didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like a confirmation. I went inside the shed, locked the door, and pulled the drawer open where I kept the folder, the one with the original deed. I spread both documents on the table. The signature transferring ownership from me to him was mine. In ink, I didn't remember signing. Under a date I barely registered. It must have been during the months after my husband's passing, when I let paperwork blur together and trusted them to handle what I couldn't. Somewhere between grief and trust, I had handed over more than just property. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I folded the papers, slipped them back into their sleeves, and went back to doing laundry. Later that afternoon, I stood in the kitchen, folding towels. Elwood came in, phone in hand, talking about yard maintenance. I waited until he paused. "When you signed my home into your name," I asked quietly, "did you also inherit the memories?" He froze, then gave a practiced laugh. "Come on, Mom. You know Callista handled the paperwork. It's just safer this way. Consolidates everything." "Safer for who?" I asked. He didn't answer. That weekend was Liam's birthday. Balloons, cake, guests. Callista had decorated the living room like it belonged in a catalog. I stayed mostly quiet, helping where I could, staying out of photos. At one point, Liam opened a present from me, or rather, one I had made. A hand-knit blanket I'd worked on for weeks. Soft blue, lined with tiny sailboats, but the tag taped to the wrapping paper read, "From Mommy's Mommy, Callista's Mom." I blinked, waiting for someone to notice. No one did. The blanket was passed around, admired, and eventually placed on a shelf with the other gifts. That night, I returned to the shed and sat for a long time, staring at the post-it still pinned to the inside wall. "Please don't make this difficult." I reached into the bottom drawer of the cabinet and pulled out a checkbook, one my husband had given me years ago from an account we never closed, one we never talked about, just in case, he'd said. I wrote a check to myself. The pen shook a little, but I finished the signature with precision. "You want ownership?" I whispered. Let's see how it feels when you don't notice mine until it blooms next door. The next day, I met with Marcus, the same realtor who helped us buy the original house. He looked older but kind. Said he had a listing nearby, walking distance, a small adobe-style home with a backyard big enough for raised garden beds. I asked to see it immediately. When we arrived, I stepped out through the gate and ran my hand along the fence that separated it from my current backyard. It was quiet. The house was modest, sun-warmed, the tiles chipped in places, but clean. Marcus handed me a clipboard. "Do you have a family moving in with you?" "No," I said, signing the bottom of the contract. "Just me. And finally, that's enough." He paused, then smiled, sliding the folder into his briefcase. I stood in the middle of the empty kitchen, looking out the window toward the house I had once called mine. I didn't feel anger, not anymore. I felt distance, calculated, necessary. I signed the papers, a pause, then a smile. And when the machine started digging, I didn't look back. I made sure they had to look forward. In the days that followed the signing, I noticed a shift. Not in the air or the light, those were the same, but in the people who shared my yard. Elwood's tone got tighter. Callista's footsteps heavier. They started making phone calls in the car, sitting there long after they pulled into the driveway. Their voices dropped whenever I entered a room. Once, as I passed by the living room, I heard her whisper, "She's too quiet. That's what worries me." I didn't stop walking. I didn't need to ask what she meant. Quiet women make people nervous when they've run out of excuses. One afternoon, Elwood left his tablet on the kitchen counter, screen still glowing. I'd only meant to check a recipe I'd stored years ago in an old email draft, but as I scrolled, a notification pinged across the screen. The subject line read, "Relocation Package, Sunrise Manor Senior Living." My fingers hesitated, then tapped. The email opened with an estimate of costs and a cheery line about compassionate transitions for aging loved ones. The thread below included Callista's words, "We'll be putting her there once the house sells. Just need her out before June." My hand didn't shake. I didn't gasp. I took a screenshot, emailed it to myself, and cleared the tab. Then I walked outside and watered the same patch of garden they forgot to mow for 2 months. A few days later, while looking for a broom in the garage, I found a box labeled "Shed Items." It wasn't sealed yet. Inside were 2 photo frames, a lamp, and a pair of slippers I hadn't seen since Christmas. Callista was taping another box closed. She didn't flinch when I saw her. "Just organizing," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I said nothing, just stood at the door long enough for her to feel it. Then I walked back to my cot and sat down, placing my palms on my knees to steady them. They weren't preparing me for the future. They were preparing to forget me. That night, I stepped outside the shed to cool off. The sky was dark, full of stars. I sat on the porch step in my cardigan, the one with the missing button I never replaced. The door clicked shut behind me, louder than usual. I turned to open it. Locked. I knocked once, lightly, then again. No answer. I pulled my sweater tighter and curled up on the wood, using my arm as a pillow. The air was crisp, but not bitter. I slept like that until the birds started fussing in the trees. When I finally stood and turned the knob, the door opened. Inside, on my cot, lay a yellow post-it. "Keep the door shut. Coyotes." They never said they locked me out, and I never said they did it on purpose, but silence, too, is a sentence. That morning I pulled out a red lipstick I hadn't worn in years, the one that made my husband grin every time I wore it to Sunday service. I brushed my hair, changed into a pressed blouse, and walked next door to my house. The floors creaked like they were happy to see me. I made a list for the contractor: new fencing, a raised bed along the east wall, and tall lavender by the back gate. When he arrived, clipboard in hand, I led him to the back fence and pointed toward the home I used to live in. I want them to see what peace looks like. He nodded without asking what I meant, and when the machine started digging, I stood in the doorway with a cup of tea, steady, warm, and ready. She digs the first hole for her rose bush and whispers, "Let them bloom in view of every silence they gave me." And as the roots settled into the earth, I knew this wasn't revenge. It was resurrection. The morning sun cut across the bare walls of my new home. Soft, golden, clean. No closed doors, no muffled voices, just silence. But this time, it belonged to me. I padded barefoot into the kitchen. The tile was cool against my soles. I filled the kettle, the water echoing into the steel sink, and reached for the coffee tin I'd kept since before Liam was born. A small ritual, familiar. I placed the deed folder next to a seed packet, zinnias, bright and untamed. That morning, I boiled coffee the way I liked it, strong with a pinch of cinnamon. I didn't miss the drip machine back in the house. Some things lose flavor when shared with people who stop tasting. By mid-morning, I was in the backyard, walking its edges with a measuring tape and chalk. The contractor arrived right on time, clipboard in hand. He was younger than I expected, polite but cautious. As he followed me to the back fence, he raised an eyebrow. "You sure you want the garden facing that direction?" I nodded, tapping my finger on the blueprint. Exactly there, right in front of that kitchen window. He gave a slow nod, not pressing further. "I want them to see what love looks like when it's not returned," I said. "Only grown." He made no comment, just noted it down and got to work. By noon, delivery trucks began arriving. Bags of mulch, wood for raised beds, stone slabs for a path. From across the fence, I noticed Callista standing on their patio, arms crossed. She didn't speak. Elwood passed behind her, paused as if to say something, then continued to the trash bins. "You could have just talked to us," he muttered when he saw me pruning lavender. I didn't look up. "So, could you?" He lingered, waiting. I kept trimming, watching the wind lift petals from a nearby bush and carry them toward their yard. That afternoon, I had lunch alone beneath the unfinished arbor. I set out a chipped plate, poured iced tea into a mason jar, and played an old record from my husband's collection. The melody floated through the garden. The notes weren't loud, but they knew how to carry across a fence. A neighbor passing by slowed down. "Those are raised beds?" she asked. "Yes," I replied, dusting off my knees. "First time I'm planting something just for me." She smiled. "Looks like you've got a good start." I nodded, thinking to myself, it's the first time I've had ground that doesn't shift under me. As evening settled, I walked the garden again. My hands brushed over herbs I'd planted that morning, still damp from watering. I hung string lights between the wooden posts, letting them drape like soft constellations. The yard glowed with the kind of warmth I hadn't felt in years, not from people, but from purpose. Back inside, I sat with a gardening book by candlelight, turning pages slowly. The house behind the fence had its lights on. I didn't peer in, but I knew they saw. I opened the back door, stepped into the moonlit garden, and kneeled beside the freshly turned soil. My fingers dug into the earth. The smell, warm, honest, rose around me. I held the rose bush carefully. One stem had been broken in transport. I trimmed it and tucked the roots in. "Let them bloom," I whispered, in view of every silence they gave me. She digs the first hole for her rose bush and whispers, "Let them bloom in view of every silence they gave me." And as the roots settled into the earth, I knew this wasn't revenge. It was resurrection. That Sunday, I hosted brunch in my garden. Just 2 chairs, a small table with chipped edges, and plates from the thrift store I polished myself. Carol from next door brought blueberry muffins. Miguel, the retired mechanic 2 blocks over, brought orange juice and a smile too big for the early morning. We talked about tomato soil, arthritis creams, and how Tucson heat was already daring May to feel like June. At some point, I noticed Elwood across the fence. He stood with his hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on our table. I nodded. Not a wave, just acknowledgement. He didn't return it, but he stayed for a moment longer than comfort would have allowed. After the guests left and I washed the dishes in the outdoor basin, I heard footsteps on gravel. I turned to see Callista holding a small cardboard box. "I figured you might want these," she said. She didn't look me in the eye. Inside were photos. Me and Elwood at his graduation, my wedding picture, a few bent baby pictures. She placed it on the table like it was a delivery. "You left these behind," she said. I looked down at the pictures, then back up at her. "You may keep them," I said. "I've already kept what matters." She nodded once, stiff, then turned and walked away. I didn't watch her leave. I didn't need to. That evening, I sat by the fire pit with a cup of peppermint tea and pulled out a letter I'd written months ago. It had never been sent, only folded and refolded until the edges softened. I opened it and read aloud. "I raised you with the hope you'd be kind, not just successful. What you did wasn't out of malice. It was worse. It was convenience. You forgot me not out of hate, but because it made life easier. And that may be the most painful part." I placed the letter in the flames. It curled slowly, then caught. When the last ash lifted, I scattered it into the soil of the herb bed. The next morning, I was trimming vines near the gate when Elwood approached. He didn't carry the weight of apology, only awkwardness. "We didn't mean to make you feel less," he said. I kept snipping. "That's the thing, Elwood. You didn't have to mean it. You just did it." He looked down, toe scuffing the dirt. "If you want to talk," I said, handing him a spare pair of gloves, "you can help pull weeds." He hesitated, then took them. We worked in silence, side by side. I didn't ask about the house. He didn't ask about the garden. It was the closest we'd come to a truce. That evening, I sipped tea as the sun dipped low over the garden. The roses were budding. The thyme smelled sweet on the breeze. I sat still and quiet, the kind of quiet I chose. "This house may not heal everything," I whispered to the sky, "but it reminds me what I'm still capable of." I went inside, retrieved a single seed from a small paper envelope, and walked to a new spot in the garden. I knelt, made a small hole with my fingers, and placed it gently in the earth. Even if they never understood what they did, I still rose from it, root by root. Sometimes the greatest act of love is reclaiming space for yourself. I didn't choose bitterness. I chose boundaries. I didn't raise my voice. I raised a garden. And in that garden, I found peace, purpose and the version of myself I thought had been lost in other people's comfort. If you're watching this and you've ever felt like a guest in your own story, I want you to remember your worth doesn't disappear just because others fail to see it. Sometimes you don't need to fight for a seat at their table. You can build your own and plant roses beside it. Now I'd love to hear from you. Has there ever been a time when you had to reclaim something that was always yours? Share your story in the comments below. If this video touched your heart, drop a 1 or let me know where you're watching from. And if it didn't speak to you, I'd still love to hear your thoughts. What didn't connect and what brought you here? If you want more stories that remind us of our strength, our resilience, and the quiet power of starting again, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your journey matters. Let's keep growing together